Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the foundations of American government. Our government, as it exists today, evolved. It came out of a lot of different sources and went through a couple of different iterations before we landed on the form of government that we have to this day. So we'll look first at English law because most of the colonies were founded by the English, and so that's why English law is sort of the underpinning of that. And English law is based ultimately on a document called Magna Carta from 1215, and that's simply where the English aristocracy got the right to have a say in government by forming something called a parliament. And once they established Parliament, then the English lords got to have a say in mostly it's about taxation. So much of government boils down to just that issue of how does the government collect and spend money. But you still had an absolute monarch up until 1689, and that's our next stop is a thing called the Glorious Revolution, which happens in England, and that's the time at which England stops being an absolute monarchy and becomes a constitutional monarchy, and now Parliament really becomes the real power. Yes, it had existed since 1215, but it's 1689 that Parliament becomes the actual government of Britain instead of ultimately the government being the king himself. And then the third aspect of English law that is relevant for looking at the North American colonies is this idea of salutary neglect. And basically, what happened is for about 100 years, England left their colonies in North America alone. They figured as long as they were contributing money to England, that they wouldn't have a problem with letting them have self rule. And so all of the English colonies had legislative bodies and they were effectively self governing and they did their own thing. And after you've gotten to more or less do your own thing for a century, when suddenly the English government says, no, you can't do that anymore, that's a problem. And that's what happened in 1763. America had just been a part of a war, both the continent and the English colonies. It was actually a European war, but there was a portion of it that was fought in North America. And we, as Americans, ended up calling that the French and Indian War. But it was an expensive war and Britain didn't want to have to pay all the costs by themselves. And so they went to the English colonies and they're like, hey, we just fought that war to help you guys. And so now you have to pay for it. And the American colonists were like, hey, yo, we didn't actually vote to go to war. You guys just decided to go to war and we had to, fight your war. So why is it that you get to decide to go to war? We have to fight the war. And at the end of it, you decide to make us try to pay for it. So this is sort of the beginning of the problems between the the government in England and the English colonies. Is this revocation of that idea called salutary neglect? Now, you may have learned a little bit about the Enlightenment in previous courses, and the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement that came out of Europe in the 1600s and 1700s. And there were a lot of ideas. It was a very large movement, but the ones that relate to American government, basically the idea that humans are good and that society should be driven by progress rather than looking backwards. And the guy that kind of embodied those ideas the most was a dude named John Locke, and he really ended up laying a foundation for most modern countries, at least Western countries. The idea that we should have a representative government, the idea that if you have a problem with your government, then you have the right to overthrow that government. He was also a big believer in the idea that all religions were equal and should be all treated with respect. Another person who was really important for America from the Enlightenment was a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he's the fella that brought forth that notion that all men are created equal. So we know that language very, very well from understanding, what America is or what we wish America is, wish it to be. And so Rousseau is the one that introduced that concept that we're all created equal and we should be treated as such. And then the third person is a guy named Montesquieu, and he believed in a government concept called the separation of powers, which we've already looked at a little bit in this course, and we'll be looking at that a lot more. This one you have definitely heard of, the Declaration of Independence. You may already be aware that it was written by Thomas Jefferson, but Thomas Jefferson was heavily, heavily influenced by the writings of John Locke and to a lesser extent some of the other figures of the Enlightenment. Some key ideas in the Declaration of Independence, and again, these will sound familiar from the previous slide, that tyrannical governments should be overthrown and that government should be established on the principle of the consent of the governed, meaning those of us who are being governed give consent to our government to act on our behalf. And if government loses this notion of the consent of the governed, then it should be thrown away and you should have another government. So clearly, this is very directed at the English government, and it has a lot to do with a lot of things that were happening, coming off of the end of the French and Indian War that I talked about. But this is not a US history class, and so I'm not going to get too deep into that. But suffice to say that the Declaration is after the first couple of paragraphs, it's just a laundry list of everything that's bad about the English government. And it was all addressed at the king, but we know from previous slide that the king was no longer the person who was really in charge of the government. Now, the king at that point could still heavily influence the government, but at the end of the day, it's the prime minister and not the king that makes the decision. However, nobody in America knew the name of the prime minister. It just that wasn't a thing people knew. On the other hand, George III's face was on all of the money. And so everybody knew who George III was. So by addressing the Declaration of Independence at George III, what it's really directed at the American people to say, hey, that government represented by that guy who you've kind of heard of, and not the prime minister, they're the real problem. So it's just this long list of all of the bad stuff that England had done. They had worked on it for a while. It went through a couple of drafts, but the final draft was approved by the legislative body that existed at the time called the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, which is why that is kind of an important date for America. The very writing of the Declaration of Independence was considered an act of war by the British, and so it's very shortly. It's actually we had already had a couple of military battles between the American forces and the British forces prior to the establishment of the Declaration of Independence. But once that document came out, and once it takes like 3 weeks to cross the Atlantic, once they heard about it, then the British were all in, and we were going to war. So the American Revolution gets going, and it didn't go well for the first couple of years. I mean, if George Washington was rated based upon the first 3 years of the war and how successful he was as a military leader, he probably wouldn't have ended up being the first president because it was kind of a mess there for a while. And part of the reason why it was a mess is because we weren't one country. We were 13 colonies, separate political entities that decided to come together and not even form a union at this point, just to come together to try to collectively fight the British off to get independence. And so, you didn't even have somebody that you could go to and say, like, hey, we need more money to be able to get more troops and supplies for the war effort. That entire structure didn't exist. And so it became fairly clear fairly early that there was going to need to be some form of centralized government, but all of the states they were pretty sketchy about the idea of there being a centralized government because they saw themselves as all being sovereign political entities. And so what they came up with was this document called the Articles of Confederation. And that kind of crystallized all of the values that existed that were common to all of the colonies in about 1777, so about a year into the war. So they wanted to have a very weak decentralized government because they didn't want to have a central government that would come in and tell Virginia what it had to do and tell New York what it had to do. So they didn't want that. There was no executive, there was no president. So just imagine, I mean, setting aside whether if whatever issues we may have with the presidency in the modern era, that you didn't have one specific figure that you could point to and say, that's the leader of the United States. That didn't exist. There was also no judicial branch at the federal level. So, of course, every state had its own judiciary, but there was no federal judiciary at all. Every state had its own money, so you couldn't really go from New York to South Carolina and be able to, keep using the same money. The US dollar didn't exist at this point. Every state also had its own militia. It was also responsible for raising its own militia. So just think about the kinds of trouble that George Washington would have in trying to field an army when he would have to go to every single colony and say, "Hey, we need some more troops." There wasn't a centralized method of being able to do that. And, after the war, they were already starting to have problems. So the war effectively ended in like 1781. There's a treaty in 1783. So in that decade of the 1780s, things were a mess. There were internal rebellions, former Revolutionary War soldiers rising up in protest because, they weren't getting paid. So, they couldn't field an army to deal with any kind of internal insurrection or rebellion. They also couldn't field an army to protect the United States from being invaded by the British. I mean, Canada is still right there. It didn't go anywhere, and the British were still in control of Canada. And so, all these problems keep bubbling up, and they're like, wait, we don't even know, we can't do anything. There was no taxation power. So, a state, every state would have its own taxes, but they could decide whether or not to give the government any money. And if they didn't want to give the national government any money, then there was no mechanism that would make them do that. So the Articles of Confederation were a mess. And, by 1787, everybody kind of realized that, but everybody had very different notions about what should follow the Articles of Confederation. Now, some of the states recognized that we were going to have to really kind of just scrap the Articles of Confederation, but not every state agreed. I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of the United States of America where every state agreed on something. And that was certainly true even before the modern United States of America came into existence. So they called this convention in Philadelphia. And the stated goal was, we're going to fix the Articles of Confederation. There were a couple of states that didn't even send any delegates to the convention because they were like, it doesn't need to be fixed. And you had other delegates come into the convention with the intent of scrapping the Articles of Confederation and just starting anew. And so, again, we don't agree on anything. We didn't agree on anything in 1787. And so they had a lot of arguments. They were essentially just locked in this room in Philadelphia in the summer. And I don't know if you've ever spent any time on the East Coast in the summer, but it's hot and nasty and gross. These guys used to wear like wool button up clothing all the time. And they kept the windows closed. Because they didn't want anybody like sneaking up and trying to listen in on what it was that was being debated. But they had arguments about how powerful should the national government be, how should representation in the new Congress work? There were different points of view on that for sure. How much power the presidency should have, and how much sovereignty, independence, should states get to keep. They recognized they were going to have to rein in some of that, but there were huge disagreements over how much power would be given over to this new national government. And at the end of the summer, they had a document called the United States Constitution. They then proceed to argue over it for about another year. Each state had to agree to what's called ratifying it. Each state ratifies it. Once they ratify it, then it goes into effect. But they didn't even require every state to ratify the Constitution. They needed to get to 10 of the 13 states that would agree, and then it would come into existence. And again, that document that still governs us to this day is the United States Constitution. And we've talked a little bit about this stuff already, but the basic division of our government is into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, right? So one makes the laws, one enforces the laws, and one interprets the laws. So that's one way we divide our government. And then the other way we divide our government is this concept that I've talked about a lot already, which is federalism. And federalism is the separation between the state government and the national government. And certain powers, the states got to keep control of and still do. And certain powers belonged to the federal government and were no longer going to be powers of the states. So this notion of separation of powers, we separate it in two directions. One is by state and federal, and the other is by dividing out the different responsibilities of government into three branches. The principle of republicanism is built into this. We have the House of Representatives, which has always been voted for by the people directly. Now, of course, who gets to vote has changed quite a lot since 1789. The United States Senate was not originally something that people voted directly for. And technically, the presidency is still not something that people vote directly for because we have this ridiculous electoral college system that we will be talking about a lot in this course. So the federal government keeps powers over things like taxation, federal taxation. States also have taxes. The military, states do not have their own military forces. You have this thing in the modern era called the National Guard, but it's not an independent military force that the the state governors have total and supreme control over. The federal government established a postal service, which is very important, and they also kept control over foreign policy. Right, states do not to get to negotiate their own treaties with other countries. Uh, we also, of course, know that the United States Constitution preserved the institution of slavery and, to that effect, gave more power to the smaller southern states. And there's a very practical reason for this, and that is that in 1789, the wealthiest states were by far the southern states that had plantation economies and used slave labor. Those were the wealthiest colonies. And as a practical matter, the other states needed the southern states to be a part of the union in order for it to be financially solvent. And so they had to give in a lot to some very dark forces coming out of the American South, namely around the institution of slavery. But that's also a reason why we have both a House and a Senate, because smaller states get more power through the Senate because every state is equal in the Senate, right? So Wyoming has two senators and California has two senators, even though California is much, much bigger than Wyoming. And then the Electoral College also favors smaller states. So there is a lot of sweetness thrown into the United States Constitution solely for the benefit of those smaller southern states. The last of the founding documents that we will look at in this presentation is the Bill of Rights. If we go back to the Constitutional Convention, again, there was a lot of disagreement, and there were some figures, such as future President James Madison, who really felt strongly that there needed to be an explicit list in the Constitution of individual rights. They wanted to make sure that there were certain things that wouldn't ever be violated in any state for any reason, and they felt very strongly that that needed to be in the Constitution. It didn't actually end up making it into the Constitution, but the Constitution has a format by which the Constitution can be amended, and it's pretty complicated, and we'll talk about it at some point in the future. But one of the first acts of the new Congress when it came into existence was to pass the Bill of Rights. Then, once it was passed, then it had to go out to all of the states to be ratified, which then started to happen gradually in 1790, before they got all of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights ratified and entered into the Constitution. The Bill of Rights focused on what people could do, what their rights were, and also what the federal government could not do. You had some people that were some of the founders were really, really excited about having a strong central government, and you had some founders who were deeply suspicious of the idea of a strong national government because they felt like they had just fought a war against a government that was being really, really oppressive, and they didn't want that. So it's all about striking a balance, and that's what they were trying really hard to do. And there was some success and some failure. So some of these individual rights you definitely are already aware of: freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I think everybody knows that the Second Amendment is, well, it is interpreted in the modern era as meaning that anybody can own a gun. That is definitely not what the founders thought it meant, but that's a conversation for another day. But one of the other things that it did is it made it very clear that states get to control any government functions that the federal government doesn't give itself. Right. So there's two pieces here. There's the Ninth Amendment, which we refer to as the elastic clause, and the Ninth Amendment says that the federal government gives itself the right to give itself new powers. Think about automobiles as an example. Automobiles did not exist in 1790, and now we have a federal seatbelt law. This is, you have to wear your seatbelt all the time, right? So they recognized that the federal government was going to have to grow and evolve, and was going to have the power to be able to make new law around new areas of government responsibility in the future. But it also says that any power that the federal government doesn't get of itself is retained by the states. And I'll just give you two examples really quick. One is education. There's very little power that the federal government has over public education. States have most of those powers. Now, the feds are the ones that make you take a standardized test every year in English and math. But for the most part, the instruction and curriculum and all that kind of stuff is really governed by the state and not the federal government. And then the other one is elections. Elections are run at the state level, not at the federal level. And there's some really good reasons for that. For example, the president does not have the power to cancel a federal election. It's in the Constitution. States administer the elections. There's no way that the president can call up the state of New Mexico and say, cancel your election. It doesn't work like that. So that is the Bill of Rights. And I hope this was a successful learning experience for you, and feel free to check out any of the other videos on the channel. Thank you for watching.